Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Heidi Daniel, President and CEO of the Enoch Pratt Free Library. And I want to thank you so much for being here tonight for this very special edition of the Brown Lecture Series featuring Dawn Porter. We're so happy to welcome our audience here in the Wheeler Auditorium, as well as all of you watching from home. First and foremost, I want to thank our donors, Eddie C. and C. Sylvia Brown. You allow us to bring authors, thought leaders, creatives, and more to Baltimore for these powerful discussions, and we are so grateful. We have a wonderful lineup of programming this fall and winter. Tomorrow morning, we have a very special One Book Baltimore virtual conversation with actress, choreographer, and director Debbie Allen. Yes, that was very exciting. This, especially if you watched Fame, as I may have, but I won't sing the song now. This November, we honor Native American Heritage Month with programming for all ages throughout all of our branches. We've also welcomed 2 new artists in residence to the Pratt Library, which we're very excited about. Journalist Lawrence Burney and photographer Shan Wallace are now working out of the Central Library as part of Baltimore's Living Archives, a partnership with the NSF Parkway Theater. You can get information on all of our Pratt programs on our website, prattlibrary.org. Now, to get tonight's event started, it's my pleasure to welcome the Deputy Chief of Central Library, Vivian Fisher.
Thank you. Good evening. As Hattie mentioned, I'm Vivian Fisher, Deputy Chief of the Central Library, State Library Resource Center at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. And I want to thank you for joining us for this evening's special Brown Lecture with Dawn Porter and Angela and Carroll. I want you also to know that all Pratt Library locations across the city are open at 50% capacity. So we hope to see you, if you haven't been here, back to visit us yet. Now I am pleased to introduce our guests this evening, Dawn Porter and Angela N. Carroll. Dawn Porter is an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose work has appeared on HBO, PBS, Discovery, and Netflix, among others. She is currently directing and executive producing an Apple TV multi-part documentary series with Oprah Winfrey and Prince Harry, which focuses on both mental illness and mental well-being. Dawn has been commissioned to create films for the Center for Investigative Reporting, Time and Essence magazines, the New York Times OpDocs, and Amazon. Her work has received generous support from the MacArthur Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, Tribeca Film Institute, Sundance Film Institute, Chicken and Egg, Pictures, and other esteemed organizations. She is a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the Television Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Directors Guild of America. Angela N. Carroll is an artist-archivist and an investigator of art history and culture. She is a curator and contributing writer for Sugarcane Magazine, Black Art in America, BmoreArt, Hyperallergic, and others. She received her MFA in Digital Arts and New Media from the University of California at Santa Cruz and teaches within the Film and Moving Image program at Stevenson University and the FYE programs at MICA in Baltimore, Maryland. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dawn Porter and Angela N. Carroll.
Hello.
I am so excited to be in conversation with you. I've watched so many of your films, and I think what's so exceptional about your prolific body of work is your commitment to community, your commitment to the subjects that you discuss. So I want to start a little bit with what I was most intrigued by when I learned about you, is that your history is specifically within transitioned and shifted into filmmaking. Can you talk a little bit about what catalyzed that shift?
Sure.
I'm so sorry to jump in the middle of this. We're having a little bit of audio issues, and hello everybody online. I just want to make sure that we're picking up all of your wonderful questions, Angela. And we'll get to that question in
Okay.
1 second. So if I could just take a look at that lab real quick, just make sure we're all right, and then maybe we'll shift to this as we go. Thank you, everyone. All right.
Better than a frozen
Check,
Zoom
check.
screen.
Aha, there you go.
Um, so my father was a photographer in New York City. There were not that many Black commercial photographers, but I spent my childhood really in his studio, which was in the far East Side. If you go to New York City, those buildings are still there. They used to be carriage stables. So there's really tall ceilings and cobblestone floors, but there's the thing that photographers and image makers love the most. There's beautiful light. And so I think I always had I felt photography, image making was really, really magical. And that was, everything was printing. So he printed his photos, his assistant printed photos. So it literally felt like magic to small me. And then we used to make Super 8 films. We had some, you probably haven't seen any of my home Super 8 film movies that I made when I was 8. But there always was that was always within me. And we had a lot of photographers around our house. That was always around me. But my father's a photographer, so you have to rebel. So I was like, ooh, I'm going to rebel and become a lawyer. Because I also was, I was describing in conversation with some folks earlier, I was a kid who loved books. I loved logic. I loved solving puzzles. And that's what I thought the law was. And then in addition to that, I thought, oh, you can help people. So I worked in Washington, D.C. for 5 years as a lawyer, and I felt what was missing from that equation was people. I wasn't seeing a lot of people. We wrote a lot of briefs, and the puzzle solving was there, and I actually liked my colleagues and I liked my work, but I wasn't really seeing a lot of people. So a partner that I was doing a lot of work for, I represented a number of newspapers, which was very interesting work. We would defend newspapers' right to publish. And he went to work for ABC television in New York. And he said, do you want to come with me? And so I did. And there I was working with journalists they would go report something in the morning and it would be on TV at night. And I was like, this is the thing to do. Why did I spend all this time writing briefs by myself? The only problem was at that point, no one is going to hire a completely inexperienced lawyer who decides, yes, she would like to be Nancy Drew, girl detective. So I was a lawyer, but then I got hired by, I did some work with the news division, and they hired me in a job called Director of Standards and Practices. And the way that my boss organized that job, I hope you will all be happy to hear that there is somebody who thinks about ethics in news gathering. And that was that department. So our job was not, can you do it as a lawyer? It was, should you do it as a journalist? Should you publish the name of a rape victim? Even if other networks are publishing, should you pay people if other networks are doing it? And so we were thinking about all of these ethical issues, and there's no rule book for that. So actually legal training was great for that, because it was really just not just what should you do in the moment, but what precedent are you setting? And I would always think about journalism. And my boss was so smart. She said, and this was in 1998, she said, if we lose the trust of the audience, we are sunk. And how prescient, right? How right she was. And so it was really hard, because you would have to stand up to reporters who were saying, like your kids would say to you, everybody else is doing it, and you can't say, if everybody jumps off the San Francisco Bridge, are you going to jump off the bridge, to reporters who are trying to compete. But that's really what I did that job for 7 years. So I spent a lot of time in edit rooms. I spent a lot of time watching, if you watch a reporter take a whole bunch of complicated facts and do it well, it really is a thing of beauty. And so it very much was in line with what we do as lawyers. As lawyers, I took a lot of depositions. I asked questions. That's my job. But I also, you have to listen. So all of that unwittingly, to me, really prepared me to do documentary film. And after I'd been doing I had 2 kids, I'd been doing this job for a while. I went to A&E television. I did a similar job, but I just got a promotion. But I realized it was right at the time when reality TV started getting really popular. And I was seeing a lot of stories about Black people, but not by Black people. And I really thought, I was like, I could do better than that. Like, how hard could it be? It's very hard. But because I'm a lawyer, I went part-time at my full-time job. And then I started a production company in my part-time. And eventually, working through all my connections, I got a grant from the Ford Foundation. And then I made my first film, which is Gideon's Army.
Yeah. And so I think if it's not too early to do so, we would love to show a clip from Gideon's Army so that we can look at and then have a discussion about that afterwards.
We're gonna step.
The stakes are as high as they could possibly be. And when we got cases that haunt us, this case will haunt me. He is a kid. And he's facing a lot of time. If he's found guilty, it will hurt him mentally and emotionally. I can't, I cannot turn around to his mother after he's been guilty. And I've told her he's going to get 10 years, at least, at minimum. And he wanted to get his job, he's working on his GED, apparently he has his girlfriend. So I think that he's been scared straight, assuming he gets a not guilty verdict and is allowed to live his life. And here's hoping that that's the end result. And we don't see happily ever afters very much in this profession, but hopefully we get us a happily ever after. So I think for anyone who's seen Gideon's Army, right, it's really the most compelling film because we know in some regards, right, what public defenders do, right? We know the sort of labor that they are tasked with. But I think it's the first time that I admittedly fully understood that sort of labor and saw how many people are conflicted with working on behalf of people who cannot defend themselves while also struggling, right? Because it isn't a position that pays very much. And for your first film, it was a very ambitious endeavor. And so can you talk a little bit about
She cocky. Yeah.
Right, which has served you well, in your career. But can you talk a little bit about what you learned, what you feel were some of the most important lessons you learned in the creation of such an ambitious project for your first film?
The truth is, I didn't really know what it was going to be. I just knew I was floored by the experience of meeting these young lawyers. And, that came from being a lawyer. And when I was a lawyer and I thought I was working really hard and I thought I was super busy, I would maybe be handling 4 cases. The lawyers I met were handling 100 to 150 cases at a time. And there's a family. You saw the family of DeMontes, right, in that courtroom. Every case has a family like that, looking at her, hoping that she's going to save their baby. And so what I was really interested in, when I also, I say to people, it's not going to work in this audience, but, what do you know about public defenders? So tell me something you know about public defenders. High caseloads. What else do you know?
Not paid very much.
They're not paid very much. Yes, this is all the sweet people who are just going to say the nice things. What have you heard about public defenders? Are they good lawyers?
Sometimes they're meeting the client at the same time as the time before.
Meet them and plead them, right? They have no preparation. They have no time. They're messy. They're those people with the folders coming out. Do you ever hear about like, ooh, I want a public defender? So now how many people in here have had a public defender? A couple of people have had a public defender. But for the rest of you, where are you getting that information? You're getting it from TV. And so that is why I became a filmmaker, because certainly some of those lawyers are meet 'em, plead 'em, not great lawyers. But a lot of them are like Brandy, and they're really good lawyers, and they go because they want to help their communities and because they believe in something called the Constitution, which says it's the only job in the Constitution. You have a right to an attorney. That's in the Constitution, right? So Baltimore actually has one of the better public defender offices in the country. Really well-known office, well-run. So does Washington, D.C. and Louisiana. But you go around the country and these offices are under-resourced. People are overworked. And like she says, we don't get happily ever afters that often. But I think what I just started following their stories, and I was just curious. I was just curious about how come I don't know about lawyers like Brandy or Travis. And so if you don't start with a big plan, you can't really fail. It's whatever you produce is going to be, but people just kept getting on board. And I had this incredible experience. A girlfriend of mine who was also a lawyer, she had gone to Ford Foundation and she was working on criminal justice issues. And I just went to meet with her and was telling her, and she said, oh, you should meet these, that I want to make a film. She said, you should meet these public defenders. So I went to meet them. I went to Alabama in July and with a camera person, and we filmed for 2 weeks. And I literally burst into tears when I first heard them, because every single one of those young lawyers was talking about the Constitution, and they were talking about helping people. And I didn't know anybody at a private law firm who was talking about those things. And so I thought, if I'm a person who cares about civil rights and I care about the law and I'm interested in, I don't know this, probably everybody else doesn't know this either. So, and there are real problems with indigent defense, but it's not the whole story. So that's why I started making this movie. And then people just kind of kept getting on board. So Ford Foundation, my friend, she didn't know anything either. She was brand new at Ford, so she didn't know she was supposed to fund a first-time filmmaker. So she just said, like, go get some tape. So I was like, I can get some tape. So I got some tape, and then I carried it around in my purse, and I begged my friends for help for months. I finally got a little reel together. And she said, great, there's just one more step. You have to show it to that person in charge of film. And I thought, shoot, I was so close to getting a grant until I had to show it to somebody who knew about film. And then she said, his name is Orlando Bagwell. Well, Orlando Bagwell was one of the directors of Eyes on the Prize. So I thought, shoot, I am sunk. Now they're going to know I'm a fraud. And so I went and I did the worst pitch I have ever done. I was sweating. I basically just put my little, like, it was a DVD in, and Orlando, wonderful Black man, he just started talking to me about the story, and that I could tell him. I could tell him about the heart of these young people, about their goals, about how most of them were the first people in their families to go to law school, and their families all thought they were going to be rich, and instead they were poor, and so nobody understood them. And I just thought that is such such an American story. Your parents have all these hopes and dreams for you. They may not match yours. So they weren't getting any love from the media. They weren't getting any love from home. And I just thought it was such a complicated story. And so then he said, we're going to give you a grant. And I thought, wow. And he said, how much do you need? Well, I hadn't thought that far. So I thought of the biggest number I could think of. And I was like, $50,000. And he said, we're going to give you $200,000 because that's what you need to start this. And that's what happened.
Awesome.
But then he also stayed involved. And the thing about Orlando is he didn't just give money. He would sit and watch the footage with me and say, tell me about her. And that was what pushed me through. Tell me about her. So I want you to see what I saw in her. A young woman in her 20s who is literally thinking about looking his mama in the eye when he goes to jail. And she cannot, the weight on her shoulders of trying as a 20-something, but she was going to do what she could. But then also think, I would say to her, like, what's the best day? What's worst? And she would say, well, I'm doing a good job here, but there's 100 other people I haven't looked at today. So you can never win in this job. And that is part of the story that I wanted to tell. But
Yeah,
that's what happened.
right on. I think what really intrigues me about your career is not only how prolific it is, but obviously you've had opportunities to do other mediums, right? But you choose and intentionally stick with documentary film. And so what is it about the medium of documentary that continues to inspire you in your practice?
I think, one thing is I just, my younger son, when we walk down the street, he'll say, do not talk to anyone. Like, just don't talk, because I find people endlessly fascinating. And I can always find something to talk about with people. And he's really nice child, and he's really otherwise quiet. So I was like, okay, I could try not to talk to anybody. I think, like, truth is so much stranger and more interesting and nuanced than fiction. I mean, could you write Trump? Like, if you wrote that, you would get rejected. They would say that's ridiculous. There's no way an unqualified racist, lying cheat who is detested in his home state is going to be able to turn the country upside down. Like, that's just fantasy. And I think what I love about documentary is finding those points of connection, no matter what your background. So with DeMontes has like a lot of tattoos, which is a big part of the story. And he wears his pants like low down, which no matter, everybody's like, pull your pants up. And if you saw DeMonte, and he's, street vernacular or whatever. So if you saw him with a group of his friends, a lot of people would cross the street and not engage with DeMontes in the eye, even though he is the sweetest and smartest and just, and then, so when I was talking I realized, like, we needed some clients in this movie. We need to humanize the toll of the criminal justice system on people who are kind of under its thumb. So, Brandy took us to his house, and his mother said we could talk to her. And in the middle of it, I had two kids. I was like, tell me about DeMontes as a baby. And she said what all mothers say, DeMontes was a very good baby. And then she took me through his picture album. Here's when he was 4, and he's in his, those little pictures that we get when kids are in school. What it does is it makes you see him as a child instead of a threat. And so then by those same people who would cross the street when they saw DeMonte's were crying at the end, worrying about their baby because he's a baby. He's 16. And so I found like there's opportunity there if you slow down and actually talk to people. There's usually some kind of way of, without hammering people over the head, there's a way of saying, look at me as a person. And that's what I find, like finding those moments in films, I think is really, that's like the greatest thing.
Yeah. I think what I really appreciate also about the choice of themes is that you consistently, or at least a significant portion of the body of work that you've created, focuses on African Americans, focuses on civil rights history, civil rights leaders, etc. And so what's amazing to me is that you consistently get funding, right? I mean, obviously it's because you're brilliant, right? But also many of these films and many of these subjects and topics could be considered too niche, right? For many film markets. And so oftentimes that's the sort of awkward conversation around, well, will we fund this? Maybe, maybe not. We did a Black film last year, right? So I'm curious about the strategies that you employ to make sure that these really important stories are consistently told, because filmmaking, as you noted, is very expensive, and it's a blessing that you were able to get a Ford Foundation grant for your first film. But what about all of the others, and how do you continue in this way?
The first film I really wanted to make was a film called Spies of Mississippi, and it was about the state of Mississippi's state-sponsored spy agency that is actually the largest domestic spy operation in the history of the United States. And it was to infiltrate the NAACP and stop civil rights. And it was, you don't know about it, right? So I could not get funding for that. I could not get funding, and I was a first-time filmmaker. So, okay, that's understandable. But then after I made Gideon's Army, which won an award at Sundance and nominated for like all these prizes and blah, 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 I still couldn't get funding for Spies of Mississippi. So then you're like, what's that about? So it wasn't so easy. And then Trapped, which is my third film, about the evangelical Black abortion doctor who is, he was an evangelical Christian. He grew up in the South, and then he performs abortion because, his words, Jesus would want me to perform healthcare, and it's Black women who are dying in the South, and so I'm going to do this. But so that film was hard to fund because it came so quickly, because I didn't have time to go around and look for money. But after Trapped, I started getting calls and people would say, do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? So the secret to getting your film greenlit is to have it be their idea. So it's very nice when it matches with what you want to do. I'm only partially joking, but I think right now, there really is an appetite for great films. What there is if you think about it, buyers are very conservative. Documentary films these days are in the 7 figures. They cost $1 million to $2 million. That is not unusual for a documentary film. That is still much less than a narrative feature, which is, if you know the movie business, movies are $100 million. So all of a sudden, a documentary looks pretty good. You can make a whole bunch of documentary series for a fraction of, and the stories are great. They're all over the place and they're so fascinating. So, but what that means is the networks and the buyers want someone who's delivered before. And so that is where filmmakers of color in particular get squeezed again, because they could have all the talent in the world, but if they haven't delivered a film, you're not going to give somebody $1 million if you, and that's not unreasonable. It just, once again, crushes filmmakers of color. Latino, Asian, Black, all of us are suffering from that. So, now I think what part of my job is to help raise those people up and say, so I do a lot of executive producing now. So we are remaking Eyes on the Prize for HBO. That is, Documentary Gods. I mean, that is the most significant civil rights series. It's a lot of pressure. And so I hired 6 documentary directors, all people of color, to direct 1 hour each, and I will supervise them. But that's so at the end of that, they will have delivered a very expensive HBO premium documentary. So no one can say to them, you haven't done it before. So that's the hope. I'm very much trying to follow my little way, like Ava DuVernay does that with folks. It's a lot. It's a lot to do your own work and try and think about people, but I think that's part of it. If nobody wants to be alone, it's not fun to be the only. That's not fun. And that also does an injustice to how many stories we have to tell. Like, one person can't do all the movies. So you want a thriving, vibrant talent pool who's constantly working. Because the way you get better is to constantly work. You have to, it's like Malcolm Gladwell and those, 10,000 hours. You have to be working all the time. Everything I do helps me become better at the next thing. If I make mistakes I make on the last film, I'll make different mistakes on the new one, but you learn, and your creativity grows.
Yeah. I wanted to see if we can, and I think how are we on time? Okay. I think what's also really amazing is that you are always covering topics that are incredibly timely, right? Even though they are within historical context. And so you mentioned Trapped, which I think is a fairly controversial film, and you created it in 2016, went to Sundance in 2016, but it speaks to the contemporary sort of jeopardy that Roe versus Wade is in right now. And so can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to create a film ultimately about abortion, about Black women, and about, as you noted, an evangelical abortion doctor?
Like, you can't make this up, right? He's a Black evangelical Christian abortion doctor. I think a lot of what I'm interested in is usually goes back to the law. And so I was very interested. I was actually making Spies of Mississippi, and we were doing interviews. I was doing an interview with Myrlie Evers. And when we finished, I like to read the local papers, and I was in Mississippi, and I read that there was one abortion clinic in the city, and that there was about to be a lot of court. And I thought, I follow this topic. How come I don't know that there's one clinic in Mississippi? Generalization here, but Black people are conflicted about abortion. Like, we just don't talk about it. So Black people are usually church going, but not necessarily Catholic. It's a different thing. We just don't talk about it. It's kind of like live and let live. Just be quiet about your business. And so I saw that this goes back also to my son. I was like, I'm going to go over there to that clinic. I want to see what's happening there. So we called up, and she said, okay, you can come over. And I had a camera with me, and Dr. Parker comes out, and he's this like very stately, elegant Black man. And I just introduced myself, and I said, I'm a filmmaker, and I'm just curious. And he said, well, come to lunch with me. And he just started telling me things that the war on women's bodies started with Black women. And he told me all these stories he would hear, women crying and saying, I would love to keep this baby. I'm married, but I just got a job, and I'll lose my job, and I can't feed the baby I have. And he really had Mr. Lewis would call it an executive session with yourself. And he said, I'm not going to let women die in back alleys. And he literally came to I think Jesus would want me to save people. And that was his personal. So he would fly. He lived in Chicago at the time. He was flying from Chicago to Mississippi, to Alabama, to Georgia, because there were no doctors who would do abortions. And there was a waiting list. And let me tell you, 95% of those women were Black and brown. And when he just framed it in a way that I had never thought of. And I thought, I am pro-choice, but I don't need to be hammering people, but I would like people to see what this means to have a Harvard-trained physician. He was using his weekends and vacation to fly and do procedures. I thought that that was a piece of the conversation we should have. And then to tell you the power of media, so I was on, John Oliver was taking over for Jon Stewart in the Daily Show. And I got this call and he said, John Oliver with I was going to be on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart. And I was like, yay. And then they were like, oh, but Jon Stewart's not here. There's this guy, John Oliver. And I was like, who's that? Nobody wants to talk to John Oliver. So I was his first serious interview, he said. But he did a whole hour on Trapped. And when the Supreme Court heard the arguments, there were all these people at the court with quotes from the movie. And I thought, that is media. That is how a message spreads, because the movie hadn't aired yet. It was going to be on PBS. It had not been released, but people saw clips on John Oliver because he has millions of people. And it was on the steps of the Supreme Court. There were clips from my characters in the movies. There's a lot of stories out there.
Yeah. And I think one of the stories that you are probably most well known for at this point is Good Trouble, about Congressman John Lewis. And so can you talk a little bit about how you were able to create this project? I did see the short clip of Mr. Lewis in Gideon's Army, and wondered if that's where that connection was made sort of years before the actual film project came to life.
It was. So I had John Lewis, he agreed to speak to the public defenders, and he told stories about, we were in Washington and there was a reception and fundraiser for their organization. And he came and he spoke, and he said to them, if it wasn't for the lawyers, I wouldn't be here today. And he told a story about Eleanor Holmes Norton, and she and a group of very young lawyers just out of law school. And what they would do is when the civil rights workers were arrested, these lawyers set up like a chain, and they would call down to the jail in Mississippi like every 2-3 hours. And somebody would call all night long for days until they got out. And he said, they took our clothes, they took the mattresses, they beat us, they poured water on us, they did all these things. He said, but they didn't kill us because they knew somebody up north was watching. And so he really, when he said, if it wasn't for the lawyers, he really meant, and so he took time out of his schedule to come talk to these young people and say, I know your job is hard, but your job matters. You are literally preserving democracy. We need to have a court system where people are represented, even if it's flawed. We can make it better, but it can't go away. And it really lifted them up. The ones who are trying to do a good job, it really lifted them up. So that was the first thing. And then I did a series about Bobby Kennedy. And we pitched this to Netflix, and I was like, this is going to be the blackest Bobby Kennedy you've ever seen, because Bobby Kennedy really was influenced by a lot of remarkable Black people, including John Lewis, who was an aide to him. John Lewis, after he was kind of forced out of SNCC, in his wanderings, one of the things he did is he volunteered for Kennedy's campaign. And he organized a rally in Indianapolis for Bobby Kennedy while he was on the presidential campaign. And that was the day that Dr. King was killed. And so John Lewis had organized this rally of Black people in Indianapolis for Bobby Kennedy to go speak. They needed the Black vote to win. That's what had brought his brother into the office, and he knew he needed the Black vote to win. So he's in Indianapolis. He gets a note saying Martin Luther King Jr. has died. He's been shot. He hadn't died yet. And the white advisor said, you can't speak. There's going to be riots. It's too dangerous. You cannot speak. And a 20-something-year-old John Lewis said, you must speak to them. You must go out there. And Bobby Kennedy listened to John Lewis, and he spoke to that audience. It is the only time that he ever invoked his brother's assassination in a public speech. And he said, a white man killed my brother, and I have that same anger and hatred in my heart, but I have not let it, overcome me. But I understand your pain and you're right, essentially. And that Indianapolis was one of the only cities that did not have a disastrous riot like so many other cities across the country. And so when I heard that story, I thought, I didn't know that. I didn't know John Lewis was close with Bobby Kennedy. When Bobby Kennedy was killed, John Lewis, that was his first major depression. And that was the only time he thought about giving up his civil rights activity because he was so close to Kennedy. So there were all these stories. So CNN then came to me and said, do you want to do something about John Lewis? And I thought, I bet there's so many more stories. And then he just, people are like, well, how hard was it? I was just like, Mr. Lewis, do you want to do a film? And he was like, yes. And that he just was really easygoing. His staff was very protective, but he was like, do you want to come to the speaker's office with me? I'm like, yes. And they were like, no. One thing I will tell you is when the squad was elected, he met with them in private. And he met with them to talk about how you transition from an activist to a legislator. And he said, and he's literally like one of the only people who could do this for them. And they all that's why they all gave interviews for the film, because I think they felt like he was one person who had retained his morality and not sold out and become a legislator. And Elijah Cummings, of course, was the first interview we did. I was telling you the story. If you've seen the film, I'm interviewing, Elijah Cummings, and he starts saying, well, I'm often mistaken for John. And I said, Congressman, are you telling me you impersonate John Lewis? And he said, yes. Because he said, people will come up to him and say, this is the great John Lewis. And he said, I don't want to embarrass the parents. So he said, I've taken a lot of pictures with people who think that I'm John Lewis. But then he said, but I am so honored to be mistaken for a great man. And we know what a great man he was. So, it was just such a moving experience. So we had a great time making his movie. We went to church, we went to his home. I was in his home in Washington. I was with him on election night when we actually left because they weren't calling the house or something. And we shut the door and said, good night, Congressman, because it was 1 a.m. And he was in his suit and he did not leave that television. It was just him and his chief of staff. He did not leave until he knew the last election was called for the House. I mean, that is a person who walked the walk just so completely.
Awesome. Beautiful. I want to take a moment to check in with a few of the questions from the audience. Some of these have already been answered, so they won't be asked. But this one I think is really telling in that it asks, what has scared you the most as a filmmaker? And we'll extend that also to as a producer.
There's sometimes that you are so intent on what you want that when you get it, you realize, what have I done? So when I was making Gideon's Army, I really wanted to film in prison. I really wanted to talk to some prisoners and hear what it was like for them. And so I just pressed to get into this jail in Mississippi. And finally they said, okay, you can come in for a few minutes with a camera. So I was so excited. So we check in to the jail, and I'm going with my public defender, with Brandy, and we go through the security, and then we go down the first set of doors, and then boom, you hear that doors lock behind you, and then they take you down, and boom, the second and third door. And I realized there was no internet, and there I was, 3 locked doors down, and I was with this guy who allegedly, by all accounts, he was later convicted, had murdered 3 people. It was a very violent white supremacist murderer. And this is what I had fought really hard for. And I could just hear my husband saying, what did you do? Why, what did you do? Then the guard, who was your size. She was like a little bit of thing. And she goes, "Oh, I'll be right back." And I was like, so there we are. We're just looking at each other. But it was a good lesson for me. And I was just like, they wouldn't leave me with somebody who they thought, well, whatever, I'm here now. But then, I really did hear his story, and the public defender representing him, he was convicted and she was upset. And he said, one thing is like, he didn't get life. So he felt it was a victory, but he said to her, "Well, you listened to me." And, I think he did commit a terrible crime, but when we went to his cell, he was sleeping 3 people in a cell, 2 bunk beds, a mattress on the floor with the urinal right next to the mattress on the floor. And the guards had painted over the slim window. So they had to spend 20 hours a day together in that space, 3 people. There's no reason to treat people like that. And so who wouldn't be crazy if you were locked 20 hours a day with no privacy whatsoever? You could only be out to go to the yard or go eat, and then you would be all locked in that room together, go in the bathroom together. It just really, really terrible. So I think he agreed, that we talk a lot about power and ethics in documentary. And I wasn't thinking from his I was like, why would he tell me all these things? Why would he talk to me? Because he could get out of that room for an hour. It was worth telling me all about his terrible childhood, every single thing. So I was afraid. It's good to be afraid. You should be afraid. You should not just go and do anything. I think, though, actually, the more afraid I was when I was making Trapped. I didn't have a lot of experience, and I showed some clips at a conference. And the next day, the anti-choice activists put my picture and my address on their anti-choice websites. Said the HBO filmmaker turns her evil lens to the unborn. And I started getting, death threats and all the rest of it. So that's my children's faces. So that was scary too.
Yeah. I want to, and I have like 1,000 more questions, and of course we're running out of time. Wanted to talk about some of your other films as well, but maybe another time. But can you talk a little bit about some of the upcoming projects that you're working on? The 50/50, the ESPN docuseries, and then you're also doing a really amazing documentary about Cirque du Soleil. Like, dude, like.
A girl does not live by tragedy alone. I am working on, is commissioned by Showtime to do a 4-part series on the Supreme Court. And this was last summer. So when they commissioned it, I was like, wow, I want to do this. This is great. But who cares about the Supreme Court? Well, now we all care about the Supreme Court. So ironically, we are filming at the same clinics in Texas where we filmed the first time, because that same clinic is going to be back before the Supreme Court, was back before the Supreme Court last week arguing, because they're some of the last clinics in Texas. Same providers are still there. Really heartbreaking situation. So we're doing that. We're also talking about voting rights. We're talking about the ideological shift of the court. We're following some voting rights activists. So I really want to do the same thing, show that the Supreme Court affects our lives. If you rule against a woman's right to choose, that's a privacy implication. That implicates IVF, contraception, gay rights, just what else is private in your life that the government can then regulate. It's going to upend a lot of constitutional law. So it is a very, very serious decision. And legal scholars are really, there's also just courtroom procedure and not following established procedure. It feels, really dangerous. And then doing a 4-part for ESPN and Disney and Hulu about Title IX. And Title IX is well known as a sports equality law, but actually Title IX is a civil rights law. it was the women realized, after influenced by the civil rights movement, that they couldn't get the ERA passed, but Title IX is 37 words, and it says you're entitled to an equal opportunity in education, which means if you are sexually harassed, that you can't get your equal opportunity in education. And the person leading that fight right now is Anita Hill. So it's really interesting. There's a lot of so it's not just sports. It's actually all equality and civil rights in places that receive federal funds. So that's a really fun one. And then Cirque du Soleil is a feature. They were locked down like all of us. They're coming back, and they invited us to embed with them for 3 months as the artists prepared to go back on stage. So it's definitely about artists being, not able. Cirque du Soleil is big and beautiful and weird and wonderful. It's really filmic, it's really beautiful and creative. And I kind of needed that in my life, like something just energetic and bright and colorful. But I think of the film as it's all of us. We all are thinking, what is our life like after COVID? Is it the same? We want to make it better, right? We all are saying we're going to be more in touch. We're going to have dinner with our families every night. Everyone's saying that. Are we really? And the artists are asking themselves the same questions. Their work is dangerous, takes them away from their families. They love their work, but how can they keep what was good about being locked down, but do this, and they're always pushing themselves. So it's a very visual, creative, which is, I love, because it's something different for me. And I think it's always important to do different things and to not just do one thing. I think I did Bobby Kennedy because I was like, this is the whitest white person you could think of. So they can't say she only is interested in Black people. But then I made him Black. So, but I think Cirque allows me to do a lot. We're doing a lot of big, colorful, big music, full orchestral score. So it's a very grand, expensive movie.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. Last question, because I know that I'm totally over time. What is the kind of dream project that you haven't necessarily received funding for yet, but if you had all of the money in the world to create, what would that project be?
I think it would actually, that would be my narrative thing. And it would be Ida Wells and the Black suffragists. There's such a great story there. What they did, Ida Wells started kindergarten in Chicago. She just did went into the South and investigated the massacres during Tulsa in the Red Summer. Ida Wells, dressed as a man, snuck across the rivers and went and interviewed massacre victims. I mean, this woman was such a brave and incredible person. She, when the famous picture of the suffragists marching in front of the White House. And so when she showed up, she had organized that march, and she showed up, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony asked her not to march in the back, and because the white women wouldn't march with her. And she said, thank you, no. And she stood by the side, and when the Mississippi delegation marched by, she stepped right in the middle of them. And so they say she integrated. She just did what she wanted to do. She brought her nursing children. She hired a nanny. She brought her nursing children with her to the White House to petition the president over lynching. I mean, she was just so far ahead of her time. And more people are knowing her story now, but many, many more people need to know what she and a lot of the other Black suffragists did. And they had a lot of conversations about the right way forward for civil rights. I mean, they are really the backbone and foundation of so much civil rights activity that would come, 2-3 decades later. So that is the dream.
Amazing. Well, we are sending lots of light and love, that you get all of the funding for that project. I'm sure all of us would love to see it. And so thank you so much for being in conversation with us. Please, let's give her a hand.
So So I would like to thank you, Dawn and Angela, for coming out and joining us tonight. And thank you to our audience for joining us this evening. Also, special thanks to the Hearing and Speech Agency for providing accessibility for tonight's event. And I do want to just add a footnote that I too love the suffragists. And in fact, we have a wonderful exhibit over in the annex. So if you haven't seen the exhibit, it was due out last year, and of course, COVID hit, but we have the entire first floor in the annex dedicated to the suffrage movement, and it also includes a lot of the African-American suffragists who are not known about. So yes, the suffragists, you must go see that if you haven't had an opportunity to see that exhibit. It's really a wonderful exhibit. So again, thank you everyone for coming out this evening, and this was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you. Let's give them a great hand. Good night.